The Second World War was not only a clash of armies and ideologies, it was a war against humanity itself. In the midst of this global catastrophe, hundreds of thousands of women found themselves stripped of freedom, dignity, and hope, imprisoned in concentration camps, forced labor sites, and civilian internment compounds across Europe and Asia. Many of these women were pregnant when they were captured. Others became pregnant inside the camps through rare moments of love and connection with fellow prisoners, through coerced relationships, or, far too often, through the brutal reality of sexual violence at the hands of guards and soldiers. For every one of these women, carrying a child was not a promise of future joy. It was an additional burden in a world engineered to destroy life. Childbirth became an act of raw defiance, a desperate struggle against starvation, disease, violence, and systematic murder. Tonight, we are going to walk through some of the darkest places humanity has ever created. We will hear the true stories of mothers who gave birth behind barbed wire, on blood-stained wooden planks, in malaria-infested jungle barracks, and during bombing raids. These are not comfortable stories. They are stories of unimaginable cruelty, but also of unbreakable courage, sacrifice, and love. They are stories that have been whispered for decades, buried under the larger narratives of battles and generals. It is time to bring them into the light. Let us begin in the heart of Nazi-occupied Europe, where the regime's obsession with racial purity turned pregnancy into a crime punishable by immediate death. When cattle cars packed with deportees rolled into Auschwitz-Birkenau, the largest of the Nazi extermination camps, new arrivals were forced onto a long ramp lit by floodlights. There, SS doctors, men like the notorious Joseph Mengele, conducted what they called selections. A flick of a gloved hand decided life or death. Any woman whose belly showed the slightest swell of pregnancy was sent to the left line, straight to the gas chambers. Mothers holding small children in their arms were sent with them. The Nazis viewed them as useless mouths to feed, incapable of labor, and therefore unworthy of even the meager rations that kept slave workers alive. To survive that first selection, women did things we can barely comprehend today. They bound their abdomens tightly with strips of cloth torn from their own clothing. They deliberately starved themselves further to prevent any visible rounding. They stood for hours in freezing cold, praying that the doctor's glance would pass over them. But surviving selection was only the beginning of the nightmare. Inside the camp, if a pregnancy was discovered later, the consequences were the same: death for mother and child. For Jewish women, who made up the majority of female prisoners in extermination camps like Auschwitz, pregnancy was part of the final solution. The goal was total annihilation. Yet pregnancies happened. Some women arrived already several months along and managed to hide it through sheer will and the emaciation that affected everyone. Others conceived in the camps, sometimes through brief, hidden relationships with male prisoners during rare moments when work details overlapped, sometimes through rape by guards or capos. One of the most extraordinary figures in this hidden world was Gisella Perl, a gynecologist from Sighet, Romania. Before the war, Perl had a thriving medical practice, a loving husband who was a surgeon, and 2 children, a son and a daughter. In March 1944, her entire family was deported to Auschwitz. Her husband and son were gassed immediately. Her daughter was sent to another part of the camp and disappeared. Perl herself was spared because Dr. Mengele learned of her medical skills and assigned her to work in the camp hospital, a place of filth and agony rather than healing. Pregnant women began seeking Perl out in secret. They knew that if they gave birth, the cries of a newborn would bring the guards running, and both mother and baby would be killed on the spot. Or worse, the baby would be taken for Mengele's horrific experiments. With no instruments, no anesthesia, no light, no clean water, Perl began performing abortions in the middle of the night on the bare, lice-covered wooden bunks. She worked by feel, using only her hands and, when she could find one, a dull spoon or a piece of wire. She estimated after the war that she performed hundreds, perhaps over 1,000, of these procedures. "Every abortion cost me a piece of myself," she wrote in her 1948 memoir, "I Was a Doctor in Auschwitz. I was killing unborn children to save the mothers so that they might live to bear children in freedom after the war." There were cases where the pregnancy was too advanced for abortion. In those instances, Perl delivered the baby as quietly as possible. If the infant cried even once, the mother, often with Perl's heartbroken assistance, would cover the tiny mouth until the struggling stopped. One survivor who witnessed such a birth described how the mother rocked the lifeless body for hours, silent tears streaming down her face, while Perl held her and whispered, "You will have other children. You must live." Perl became known among the women as the Angel of Auschwitz, though she rejected the title, tormented for the rest of her life by what she had been forced to do. After liberation, she emigrated to the United States, rebuilt her life, and delivered thousands of healthy babies in New York, each one, she said, a redemption for the ones she could not save. Not every medical prisoner in Auschwitz bowed to the pressure in the same way. Stanislawa Leszczyńska, a Polish Catholic midwife from Łódź, was arrested in 1943 for helping Jewish families obtain false papers. She arrived at Auschwitz with her daughter, also a midwife. The camp authorities discovered her profession and ordered her to take charge of births in the women's infirmary, a long, unheated barrack filled with dying typhus patients, with a rusty stove serving as the only delivery surface. On her very first day, the camp doctor, a man named Mengele was sometimes present, ordered Leszczyńska to kill every newborn infant. Drowning in a bucket was the preferred method, or injection of phenol directly into the heart. Leszczyńska looked him in the eye and said calmly, "No, never. Children are sacred." She refused every single time, even when threatened with death herself. Over the next 2 years, from April 1943 until the camp's evacuation in January 1945, Stanislawa Leszczyńska delivered more than 3,000 babies in that hellish barrack. She worked with almost nothing, no soap, no clean linens, no scissors, no medications. Mothers lay on bare planks covered in old blood and excrement. Labor often lasted days because the women were so weakened by starvation. Leszczyńska and her daughter cleaned newborns with water boiled on that same rusty stove when they could, wrapped them in paper or rags, and handed them back to mothers who had no milk to give. The fate of the babies depended on their appearance. If a child had blonde hair and blue eyes and looked Aryan, it was sometimes tattooed with a number and sent away to a Lebensborn home to be raised as a German. All others, Jewish babies, Roma babies, Polish and Slavic babies, were taken from their mothers immediately. Many were drowned in a barrel by the SS midwife known as Sister Clara, a German nurse who had been convicted of infanticide before the war and was recruited for exactly this purpose. Others were simply left to freeze or starve. Leszczyńska could do nothing but baptize them secretly with a drop of stolen water and whisper a prayer as they were carried away. Despite the horrors, Leszczyńska maintained an extraordinary calm that survivors remembered decades later. She told mothers, "Hold your head high. You have brought life into the world, and that is a victory no one can take from you." Remarkably, not a single mother died in childbirth under her care, an astonishing feat given the conditions. Of the more than 3,000 children she delivered, historians estimate that only about 30 survived to see liberation. The rest perished within days or weeks. After the war, Leszczyńska returned to Łódź and resumed her midwifery practice. She was later beatified by the Catholic Church for her refusal to participate in the killing. Her testimony at the 1946 doctor's trial in Krakow helped convict several camp medical personnel. Some babies born in the camps did beat impossible odds. One of the most famous is Eva Clarke, born on April 29, 1945, in a small subcamp of Mauthausen in Austria, just 12 days before the arrival of American troops. Her mother, Anka Bergman, a Jewish woman from Czechoslovakia, had been deported to Auschwitz in 1944 while already pregnant. Anka managed to hide her condition through selections, roll calls, and even a death march. By the time she reached the Mauthausen subcamp, she weighed less than 80 pounds and was barely able to stand. She gave birth to Eva on a wooden table in an abandoned factory, with no doctor present, only another prisoner who had some medical knowledge. Eva weighed just 3 pounds. Her first clothes were strips of an old blanket, and her first cradle was a wooden crate used for coal. Both mother and daughter survived, and today Eva Clarke travels the world sharing her mother's story of defiance. Another miracle baby was Angela Orosz, born in December 1944 inside Auschwitz itself. Her mother endured starvation and medical experiments while pregnant. Angela was so small at birth, barely over 2 pounds, that she could not even cry loudly enough to be heard. That silent cry may have saved both their lives. Angela is one of the very few documented Jewish children born in Auschwitz who survived the war. The horrors were not limited to Auschwitz. In Ravensbruck, the largest concentration camp exclusively for women, more than 130,000 female prisoners passed through the gates between 1939 and 1945. Most were political prisoners, Polish resistance fighters, French communists, Soviet soldiers, Jehovah's Witnesses. Pregnancy in Ravensbrück meant forced abortion or sterilization for many. Late in the war, as the regime began to collapse, some women were allowed to carry to term in a so-called Kinderzimmer, a children's barrack. In reality, it was a death room. Mothers received almost no extra food, and infants were deliberately starved. Allied investigators, after liberation, found rooms filled with tiny, emaciated bodies. Yet even here, a few children survived through the secret help of camp mothers, women who shared their own minuscule rations and risked severe punishment to keep babies alive. The Nazi regime's attitude toward birth was starkly schizophrenic. While they murdered prisoner babies without hesitation, they simultaneously ran the Lebensborn program, Fountain of Life, for racially valuable women. Unmarried German women who became pregnant by SS officers were welcomed into luxurious maternity homes where they received the best medical care, nutrition, and rest. Their children were adopted into elite Nazi families or raised in special orphanages to become the next generation of the master race. Thousands of Aryan-looking children were also kidnapped from Poland, Czechoslovakia, and Norway and placed in these homes. The contrast between a Lebensborn villa and an Auschwitz maternity barrack could not be more extreme. Sexual violence was a constant threat in the camps and contributed to many pregnancies. Guards, capos, and SS officers raped women with near total impunity. Some camps even had official brothels where selected prisoners were forced into prostitution. Women who became pregnant from rape faced the same impossible choices as others: attempt a dangerous self-induced abortion, seek help from someone like Gisella Perl, or try to hide the pregnancy until birth, and then almost certainly lose the child. Now let us cross the globe to the Pacific Theater, where a different kind of captivity awaited Allied civilians after Japan's lightning conquests in 1941 and 1942. When Singapore, Hong Kong, Manila, Java, and Sumatra fell, Tens of thousands of European and American women and children, wives of businessmen, missionaries, teachers, nurses, were suddenly enemy aliens in territory controlled by the Imperial Japanese Army. They were rounded up and marched into civilian internment camps. These were not extermination camps like Auschwitz, but they were places of slow, grinding death through starvation, disease, and neglect. In the Philippines, the largest camp was Santo Tomas in Manila, where more than 4,000 internees were held behind barbed wire in a former university campus. Rations started bad and got worse. A daily cup of thin rice porridge crawling with weevils, occasionally supplemented with a spoonful of canned bully beef or a few leaves of weeds. Malaria, beriberi, dysentery, and tropical ulcers killed dozens every month. Pregnant women were not excused from labor. They worked in the communal vegetable gardens, bent over in the blazing sun until the day they went into labor and were expected back at work within a week or two. Births took place in a makeshift clinic with one overworked doctor and almost no supplies. American nurse Margaret Sams kept a secret diary throughout her 3 years of captivity. She described women giving birth on bare wooden tables during Japanese air raids, with bombs shaking the ground and shrapnel flying overhead. Newborns were wrapped in torn sheets or old newspaper because there were no diapers or blankets. Mothers whose bodies were ravaged by malnutrition often could not produce milk. Babies wasted away in front of their eyes. Yet the women of Santo Tomas organized themselves with remarkable resilience. They formed underground support networks, smuggling extra food when possible, sharing precious rags for diapers, taking turns rocking crying infants so exhausted mothers could sleep for an hour. They even held secret baby showers, pooling tiny gifts like a bar of saved soap or a hand-sewn cap. Similar stories unfolded in the women's camps on Sumatra in the former Dutch East Indies. Camps like Bangkinang, Palembang, and the infamous House of Seven Doors held thousands of Dutch, British, and Australian women and children. Conditions were perhaps even worse than in the Philippines because of the remote jungle locations and complete isolation. Rations were sometimes nothing more than a handful of sago palm starch and boiled cassava leaves. One survivor from Palembang recounted a woman going into labor during the daily dawn roll call when all prisoners had to stand at attention for hours in the tropical heat. The Japanese guards refused to let her leave the line. Fellow prisoners quietly crowded around her, shielding her from view with their bodies, while she gave birth right there in the red mud. As soon as the baby emerged, it was passed hand to hand under shirts and skirts until the women were dismissed back to their barracks. The child survived. In Bangkinang camp, a group of Dutch women with nursing or midwifery experience formed a secret team. They delivered dozens of babies over the years, using sharpened bamboo as scissors and boiled rags as bandages. They sang soft lullabies in Dutch to mask the sounds of labor from patrolling guards. Sexual violence occurred in these camps as well, though it was less systematically organized than in Europe. Japanese guards sometimes assaulted women during searches or isolated work details. Pregnancies resulting from rape were carried in silence. After liberation, some mothers raised these children themselves. Others placed them for adoption quietly. The stigma lingered for decades. Hundreds of babies were born across the Japanese civilian internment camps in Southeast Asia. Many died within weeks from malnutrition and disease, but dozens survived, carried in slings fashioned from torn mosquito netting, nursed by mothers who shared whatever thin milk they could produce, protected by an entire community of women who refused to let the next generation perish. On the Eastern Front, Soviet women captured by German forces faced yet another variation of horror. Hundreds of thousands of female Red Army soldiers, partisans, and civilians were sent to forced labor camps or POW sites. Pregnant prisoners were sometimes segregated into special mother and child barracks, where conditions were deliberately designed to be lethal. Minimal food, no heat in winter, no medical care. The goal was to let infants die of natural causes while extracting as much labor as possible from the mothers. Some women managed to smuggle their newborns out to sympathetic villagers or partisan units in the forests. Many did not. When liberation finally came, whether by the Red Army in Europe or Allied forces in the Pacific, it was often bittersweet. Soldiers walking into the camps were confronted with sights that haunted them forever. Skeletal women, skin stretched over bones, clutching tiny infants wrapped in rags or paper. In some cases, mothers had lost so much weight that they could no longer lactate. Liberators rushed in evaporated milk, glucose, and vitamins, but many babies were already too far gone. In Auschwitz, when Soviet troops arrived on January 27, 1945, they found a handful of children who had somehow survived, including a few born in the camp. In Santo Tomas, American forces liberated the camp on February 3, 1945, amid scenes of joy mixed with profound grief as mothers realized their infants had not lived long enough to see freedom. Today, only a small number of these camp babies are still with us. Some bear faded Auschwitz tattoos on their tiny arms. Others carry scars from jungle infections or memories of hunger that never quite fade. They have become the last living witnesses to their mother's courage. People like Eva Clarke, Angela Auschwitz, and survivors from the Asian camps travel and speak, not seeking pity or revenge, but simply asking that we remember. The women who gave birth in captivity never asked for medals or monuments. Many never even spoke of their experiences until late in life, carrying the trauma in silence. What they did, bringing life into places designed exclusively for death, was an act of the purest resistance. In the coldest, cruelest corners of the 20th century's greatest horror, they proved that the instinct to protect a child can outlast any regime, any ideology, any attempt to crush the human spirit. Their children, born in chains, wrapped in rags, cradled in coal boxes or newspaper, are walking free today because their mothers refused to let the world end them before it began. We owe these women more than we can ever repay. The least we can do is remember their names, their stories, and their unbreakable love. Never, ever forget.